Frantz Fanon's groundbreaking book, Black Skin, White Masks, is a celebrated text for many Antilleans and black men suffering under French oppression. In his book, Fanon's goal is, quote, for man to admit he is absolutely nothing. Fanon goes on to say, in other words, nothing more nor less than the capitulation of man, unquote. Fanon goes on to critique the elements of colonialism and its manifestation in racist societies. However, I, as Fanon's reader, am unable to identify with much of the examples that he provides. I am not a black Antillean man, and I will never come to personally understand the experiences of such a man. This is not to say that I, or people like me, have not been oppressed. I am a woman, I am part Chinese, I am of mixed race. In some ways, I embody the oppressor, and in some, the oppressed. When I read Black Skin, White Masks, I struggle to find meaning for me and people like me. Almost for me specifically then, in his introduction, Fanon explicitly states that because he is an Antillean, his observations and conclusions are valid only for the French Antilles, his caveat, at least regarding the black man on his home territory, unquote. Thus, the majority of the book is about the black man, case studies, psychiatric patient examples, literary texts. In short, his entire text is aimed at an audience that is not me. Fanon makes very universal claims in Black Skin, White Masks. He says that all forms of exploitation are identical, and that colonial racism is no different from other racisms. Prabhu calls this a historical universal narrator. Fanon is extending his knowledge of being an oppressed person onto all oppressed people. And though this extension to all colonized people is often unwarranted, when Fanon outlines what he calls his right, his duty, and his goal in his concluding paragraph, his ideas sound very utopian. He says, I acknowledge one right for myself, the right to demand human behavior from the other, and one duty, the duty to never let my decision renounce my freedom. Later on he says, I, a man of color, want but one thing. May man never be instrumentalized. May the subjugation of man by man, that is to say, of me by another, cease. His ideas here are rather idealized, but they are still bound in Fanon's individualized experience. So, this begs the question, can Fanon's book title, Black Skin, White Masks, be extended to all skin colors of all oppressed people? I say yes. Critic Irene Genzier, in her book Frantz Fanon, A Critical Study, agrees with me. She says, in Black Skin, White Masks, the poet, referring to Fanon, reached out and in doing so made his agony a bond of fraternity. Genzier believes that by expressing his fragility and becoming more vulnerable, Fanon is able to extend his experience of a colonized person to all colonized people. Peter Hudis agrees. In his book, Frantz Fanon, Philosopher of the Barricades, he says that as a reader, you must lose yourself in the particular in order to find your way to the universal. In other words, as readers, we must fully engage in Fanon's particular story to be able to see the application value to the real world and to our stories. In her book, Colonialism, Post-Colonialism, Anaya Lumba brings up the main counter-argument to my claim. Her first counter-argument is that Fanon does not take into account class and gender considerations into his argument. It is true, Fanon in his book dismisses the female as an equal colonial subject in need of emancipation from her white mask. And he also does not take into consideration class of any kind. Lumba's second argument is that Fanon's description of a split neuroses is experienced differently by each colonial subject. For example, Hu Taiming in Orphan of Asia would resonate more with the title Taiwanese Skin, Chinese and Japanese Mask. However, I contend that Faneau's work is applicable to all people because of our ability to empathize and identify with stories. Faneau could not have written this book with anyone other than himself in mind. He does not have the experience of a woman or of a person living in Asia or Africa or the Americas. No, he is a black man from the Antilles, and his own subjectivity and exclusivity to his own experience is what makes his experience so valid. The subjective experience of one can be understood by all who have experienced subjectivity. Our ability to relate and empathize with Faneau's story allows us to be able to engage in his work. This engagement with Faneau's work and the fact that our society does not reflect his goals is what continues to make Faneau relevant today. In Christopher Lee's book, Toward a Revolutionary Humanism, he argues that even though Faneau's arguments are often fixed to a particular time and place, his arguments continue to be relevant because the conditions of racism, colonialism, and economic oppression that Faneau fought against still exist around us today. Thus, Homi Bhabha, in his article Remembering Faneau, Self-Psyche and the Colonial Condition, argues that Faneau is urgent. Until every last person is liberated from their oppression, Faneau's mission cannot be dismissed. We must gather together under a common cause to fight oppression. In his conclusion, Faneau gives us a practical application for our lives. He says, "It is through self-consciousness and renunciation, through a permanent tension of his or her freedom, that man or woman can create the ideal conditions of existence for a human world. Superiority, inferiority, why not simply try to touch the other, feel the other, discover each other?" With this convicting quote, Faneau encourages his readers not only to fight for the emancipation of the Black Antillean, but for their own freedom as well. Faneau will continue to be relevant and urgent until we lay to rest the deep roots of oppression and instead create the ideal conditions of existence for a human world.